Welcome to Hope on Fire, relevant talk radio for young adults. Whether you're 25 or 45, there's bound to be a discussion that you care about. Our mission is to share practical ways to find God in your everyday life. Our host today is Sabine Vatel.
The death of a beloved relative, the loss of good health, a breakup, the end of a career, or a dream of any kind affect us all. Losses of any kind have a profound effect on us in ways we sometimes don't realize. We all have experienced some type of loss, but many know little about how to handle other people's grief, let alone their own. I'm Sabine Vatel, your host for today, as we discuss living through the pain of a loss. Welcome to Hope on Fire. This broadcast aims to offer hope to those struggling to find meaningful life after losing something or someone precious to them. I invite you to stick around if you need encouragement or for yourself or someone you know. And we have here with us, Rick, my co-host today. Rick, I'm glad you're here for this topic.
Yeah,
very important topic.
You bet.
And we have a very special guest I'm excited about. And her name is Roberta Fish. And I'm going to tell you a few things about her. I mean, it's a huge list, but we're going to do our best here. Psychotherapist for 18 years, currently in private practice. She has a background in behavioral sciences, nursing, college chaplaincy, theology, and all this experience to help bring important insights in our topic of grief and loss today. And, I thought it was interesting. You're the wife of Howard Fish. He's a healthcare chaplain at Florida Hospital Fish Memorial. That's no right. relation. A mother of 3 young adult sons, all redheads. That's a nice tidbit. And currently professor of religion and psychology at Florida Hospital College of Health Sciences. Welcome to Hope on Fire. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. The reason why talking about grief matters so much is that oftentimes it's the elephant in the room.
Yes.
It brings this type of awkwardness to talk about people's sadness, and just wanted you to comment on that.
Absolutely. And even talking about, a huge loss, of course, that we think of as death, and talking about death, I mean, we have this taboo of talking about that. We even use euphemisms instead of, saying, our loved one died, we say they passed on or we lost them or, just because we're uncomfortable. We have that sort of taboo about talking about it. And then the idea of expressing emotion, especially tears or something,
right.
we have that sense
Another taboo.
Yeah, exactly.
Connected together.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, considering, is that part of your interest in this topic? I mean, you've taught this for quite a while, classes on there. You're somewhat of an expert on this. And what kind of led you to teach and interest in loss and grief?
Well, of course, before I was at the college as the chaplain and now as a professor, I did full-time private practice. And, I would say that most people who come into psychotherapy or counseling, a core issue for them is grief. Because loss is varied. It isn't just the loss of a loved one in death, although that's a major one.
Right.
But, people grieve about the loss of a childhood that they didn't have, or the loss of hopes and dreams, or dealing with the loss of health. So really a very core issue, I think, for all counseling and psychotherapy is the issue of loss. So it was natural then when I went to the college as the chaplain and started teaching one class. That was the class that I taught. And
right.
so I've taught it now for about 8 years, probably maybe 50 times, I guess.
Yeah, we get to benefit from all your insights. And, you mentioned some losses as well. Because oftentimes when we think of grief, well, let's define, how do you define grief?
Grief, I would say, is the emotional behavioral response to any kind of loss. And of course, death is a big one, but there are many, many kinds of loss in our lives.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when we say losses, and you describe one that I wouldn't have normally, maybe most people wouldn't have thought of that, the loss of a childhood, the transitionary part of life. Are all losses, how could I ask this? Because you talk about a loss of a grandmother, let's say, or a loss of, I can't equate it with any type of loss, but are all losses equal in a sense?
Well, one of the things that we do with any loss or any death is that it has to do with the meaning that we put on it. And so, it's sad to lose a grandparent, let's say, but the meaning we put on that is, well, they lived a good long life, or they were ready, or whatever. When you look at the worst loss, the worst death loss, I would say it's the loss of a child. And I think that's the hardest one for people to recover from. And I think that all the grief literature says that's the worst loss. And part of it is because of the meaning that children shouldn't die.
Right.
You know, that children shouldn't die before their parents. And so that is a loss that young adults experience because, you know, childbearing losses, you know, they experience miscarriage, you know, abortion, or the death of a child through SIDS or something like that. And so that is a young adult loss usually.
Yeah. And as you talk about childbearing, I think about the difference of losses between men and women. You know, how do they differ? And of course, I don't want to get into stereotypical things, but really, is there a difference between the genders?
I don't think you can not be stereotypical about it. I mean, the fact is, you know, guys don't know how to handle grief or don't know how to handle emotion in general. I think a lot of times, at least we've been taught not to,
There's
to express
that
it.
message.
That's the expectation of
So I would
society.
imagine there's got to be a huge difference between the way men and women, you know, affect, you know, their emotions and how loss affects them, right?
Right. You know, they did a big ethnographic study with like 78 different cultures. So this is not just America, but cultures in general. And they found that women tended to be there was more weeping, more sadness, more self kind of mutilation or, you know, that sort of thing, more, you know, taking on the grief themselves. And men tended to be more external with it, more maybe aggressive or anger, some kind of acting out behavior, that sort of thing. But I will say that that's one of the biggest issues with the loss of a child, and why so many times parents who lose a child really do need to do some counseling work because what ends up happening is that becomes a wedge between them, the difference in how they grieve, you know, and of course, you know, we talk about, you know, the general idea that men grieve a certain way and women grieve a certain way, but of course, when you look at individual situations, that can be very different, you know, and it may be the opposite, where the man may have the emotional response and the woman may not. So it's really important to be able to reframe that and to know that because someone isn't expressing their grief a certain way doesn't mean that they don't feel that loss and that the loss wasn't important to them. And so that's an important issue, I think, to work through for young adults when they lose a child.
That's very good. You know, now you mentioned in practice how you encountered people who dealt with grief. It's also possible to grieve and not even know that you're in the midst of it.
Yes.
You
Well,
know?
and I think when people grieve, I think it's possible to not know, but I think normal grief, or when people grieve normally, they just do that. They go through the different tasks of grieving, and you know it takes time, and they do it normally. Sometimes people have difficulty with grief, then they need some help, some professional help. But you know, it's a normal process.
You know what, the process, I don't know about you, Rick, but in class, in like sociology class maybe, they talk about Kubler-Ross and the stages of grief, and I think about denial and then bargaining. I don't know, all the steps, they don't come to my mind.
Depression, acceptance.
Right, when I went through a loss of any kind, and I would think in my mind, okay, I go through this, I go through that, but I find out that it's not that linear, isn't it?
Right.
So,
it's not that linear. It's not that universal.
Yeah.
And you know, it's also, you know, sometimes we go through certain parts of those stages, and sometimes we keep going back. You know, we may go to some form of acceptance, and then we go back to anger again, or you know, and that's why we use the word process, because you can't just, you know, check off the list. You know, and it's something where people move back and forth through the whole grief process.
Okay, so just because you're back at a certain level doesn't mean that you're not progressing.
Right.
Doesn't mean something is wrong with you if you're feeling sad.
You know, one of the things, too, that's important to know, a lot of people feel like, you know, when you have had a great loss, let's say the loss of a child or the loss of a spouse or the loss of a parent, you know, there's this really deep, dark grief place where you're just really, you know, really feeling that sense of loss. And then you maybe move past that and you start to feel a little better and you think, oh, okay, well, maybe I'm getting past it. And then something will come up, an anniversary, a song you hear, and you are back there again in that same place. And the feeling is, oh my goodness, I haven't made any progress. I haven't, done this work of grieving. But what I tell people is that you will go back, and that place will feel exactly the same as it did as that terrible pain in the beginning. But as time goes by and as you work it through, you go back there less often and you stay there for a shorter period of time. And that's part of the work of grief. You do go back there.
So at least you can recognize progress and that you're healing
exactly.
through it.
Yeah. Yeah. Roberta, I think it's so important for people to hear that and to be
Yes.
encouraged by what you're telling us right now.
Yeah.
I think it's just a big thing, at least for guys, is like I shouldn't have to go through this, or you know what, I'm going to suffer through it. I'm going to get through it. And I think, is there a danger where some people might not even realize they're going through a grieving process, or they thought they've moved on, but they haven't? I mean, does that happen?
Sure. And I think as Christians, especially, that can be dangerous for us because, sometimes the message is, well, I'm going to see that person again, or I have the Christian hope. And we do have the Christian hope, but I love what Paul says in Corinthians, so to his letter to the church in Corinth. He said, we do not grieve as others who have no hope. It's interesting that he didn't say we do not grieve.
Right.
He said we don't grieve as others who have no hope. So we do grieve, and really for Christians, we have this, two sides. One is we have the hope that we will see that person again, and that's a wonderful hope. And on the other side, we have this loss, this very deep human loss that we have. And, even if you look at, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept.
That's right.
And weeping and grieving is part of being a human. In the world we will have trouble.
Right. So there's no shortcut to this thing.
No.
Now,
isn't.
I've heard, you have to grieve this thing. And I know in the next part of the program, we're going to talk about how to help somebody who's grieving and the myth associated with grieving. But what does it look like, and it must be simplistic, but to grieve? Like, what does it mean to grieve? Is just cry it out?
Well, there are really there was an interesting study that was done and by William Worden called the Harvard Bereavement Study. Huge study on bereavement, and he said that number one, we have to grieve. Number two, there are 4 tasks to grieving.
The 4 tasks of grieving.
Right. So maybe we can
go
back,
into those. Go into that. And another one I'd love for you to address is the idea of how we sort of traumatize the griever. Is that a word? Griever? The person griever. By the false ideas that we have about grief. The disenfranchised.
Yes.
Yeah. So we invite you to come back and learn more about grief and how to help somebody you love right after this short break. Well, welcome everyone to Hope on Fire. I'm your host for today, Sabine Vatel, and we're talking about living through the pain of a loss. And I have here with me Roberta Fish and my co-host Rick Mann, and we're talking about the task of grieving, and that even young adults have to face it, and in a healthy way. And we were about to talk about the 4 tasks of grieving.
Right. There are four tasks that they found in the studies, and the first one is accepting the loss. It's really the sense of really knowing this person is gone, and they're not coming back. It's very important to do that. Sometimes when for instance, there's no body where somebody can actually see the person, touch them. This is their loved one and they've died. That can complicate grief, or that it's difficult for them to work through that, accepting the loss. Or if you have a loss of a loved one and it's in another country and you can't be there when they're gone, it's hard to accept that until you're actually there. So accepting it is the first one, and the second is expressing the pain.
Expressing the pain.
Experiencing the pain. And different people, of course, experience it and express it in different ways. You know, we all have our own personalities and how we do that. But experiencing the pain is very difficult. But of course, we don't like pain. And so a lot of times we try to avoid that. And sometimes people turn to, you know, addictions or any number of things.
To numb that pain.
Right, to stay away from that.
You know, Roberta, have you seen in an instance, for example, somebody has gone through a loss and they'll be either stoic or cheerful, and people will say, wow, they're such a great Christian, and they're so strong.
They're so strong.
Yeah.
And I would look at that and say, that concerns me, you know, because we don't know, of course, what people are doing in the privacy of their own room. But on the other hand, if you go through a loss and you do not experience the pain, you're not working through the tasks. And it will be expressed somehow, some way. And I believe even a lot of times people experience that pain physically because they're not willing to express it emotionally. And I've had people sit in my office, a woman who was in her late 60s, for the first time grieved the death of her firstborn child.
Wow.
And, you know, she had to shut herself off from life in many ways in order to not feel that. So that's the other thing, that when we aren't willing to experience the pain and work that through, then we have decreased intimacy because we've shut off a part of ourselves. So we can't
connect
with people or even with ourselves. So working through the grief is really important. I believe it's very powerful. Yeah. The third task is to really adjust to the space of the person being gone, or not only the space, but the tasks or the duties. You know, if it's a husband and wife and, you know, your husband always did the bills and now he's dead, now you've got to do the bills. And, you know, you have to look at the fact that his chair is sitting there empty, or you know, if you lose a child, you know, you have to dismantle the nursery or their room, or you know, it's like there's that way of adjusting to the space without that person there.
So number 3 is, again, number 1 is accepting the loss. Number 2 is experiencing the pain, and the third one you just described is
adjusting to the space or
of the person being
taking
gone.
on the roles, you know, that sort of thing. And then the fourth one is withdrawing the energy that we have on that person and investing it in something else or in someone else. And, you know, that's the last one, and that takes time. You know, sometimes I had a woman come to me, her husband had died 2 years before. She worked at the college, and she said, I just, you know, I'm ready to take off my wedding ring. Is it time to do that? And how do I tell my kids, and what do I need to do? And, you know, we talked about it so she could work that through. So those are the 4 tasks. And a lot of people go through those tasks and don't even really know they're going through them.
Okay, it's not a list that you're checking. And
They just do it. It's the normal way of grieving.
Well, what about somebody that then actually get to experience those 4 steps? You know, what happens to those type of people, and what are some of the issues that might come up because of it?
Right, and that's a problem, because when we don't accept the loss, you know, then we hold on to that person, and we can be masked grief or absent grief or chronic grief, you know, and we call that, I mean, there's several names that we can use. We call it either traumatic grief or complicated grief or pathological grief. And there are, you know, a certain percentage of people, I think it's about 6%, that just can't work it through on their own, and they need help to do that. There was a woman that came to see me. Actually, her husband brought her. She had lost her son as a teenager 7 years before. And there were 3 other children in the family. They lived in a 3-bedroom house, and one of the bedrooms was still dedicated to her son.
Wow.
You know, it was like a shrine. All his, you know, posters and clothes and all of that.
Wow.
And she couldn't let go of it, and yet it was impacting her family's life. You know, she wasn't available to the family. The house wasn't available to the family. And here there were 3 other children. And we had to sit and really look at what would it mean for her to take apart that room, you know, and what would it mean for her to let go. And for her, she had to accept the loss, and she hadn't really done that. She was holding on to him, you know.
You know, on one hand, as I'm listening to you, 2 questions come to my mind. On one hand, we're saying we want people to express their sadness and cry and or however it is that they're supposed to express it. And somebody's listening to us and saying, you know, they've been Because there's this idea, especially I think, I don't know if it's a generalization in this culture, that, okay, it's been long enough now. It's time to move on. And he's gone, she's gone, or, I don't know, the job is gone, the dream is gone. Is there a time frame in which you got to worry about this person?
Yeah, and that's a tough one because for two reasons. Number one is that different cultures have different sort of normal grieving patterns, so in some cultures, it might be normal to grieve 3 or 4 years. In our culture, for whatever reason, we sort of have the idea that you should be over it by a year or 2 at the most,
Wow.
And if it's a really big loss, like the loss of a child, I don't know. We have to be careful by setting up this time frame. On the other hand, somebody should be moving through the steps. They might be doing it slower, but if they're still not accepted the loss, they're not moving through the steps, and we have to be concerned about that for their sakes.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
My next question is, for you, is now, for the young adults who are listening to us, there's certain losses that are particular to them, is there not?
Right.
You mentioned the loss of a
the
child.
The death of a child is certainly, because SIDS is a death that happens to young adults.
Right.
That's pretty much when a child dies, sometime in their first year of life. Another loss that young adults have is what we call childbearing losses, where they might either have a child that's born still, or they might have a miscarriage, or the other thing is if someone chooses to have an abortion for some reason. And a lot of times for like childbearing losses, like a miscarriage or an abortion, those are what we call disenfranchised grief, because...
And that means...
Well...
dismissed or?
Yeah, sort of dismissed. The idea that we don't recognize the grief, we don't recognize the loss as a loss. A lot of times somebody has a miscarriage and somebody will go, oh, well, you'll have another one. You're young, but it's like, oh, no, I wanted that child, And so when
and the abortion, usually if it's voluntary,
if it's an elective,
they did it to themselves.
Right, so we figured, well, they shouldn't have grief. They made that choice, So disenfranchised grief means when there is no support or little support for the loss, or there's no funeral rituals or rites, because usually if somebody has a miscarriage, we don't have a funeral, so what do you do to kind of, the funeral rituals help people work through the tasks, they help them to experience the grief, they help them to accept the loss. And so it's disenfranchised. Other disenfranchised losses, would be things like the griever isn't recognized, or, somebody loses a pet, and we think, well, big deal, it's a pet, but it can be a very big deal,
Sure.
So, but the other losses for young adults we were talking about, so loss of a child, childbearing losses. The biggest cause of death for young adults is accidents. And so many times young adults will have a loss that is sudden and a violent loss, of that. And that's that can complicate grief, because there's no time to prepare and there's no time to think about it.
Sure.
And then the last one would be loss through a disease. We don't talk much about AIDS. Now we seem to have diminished to some degree the death rate because of some of the medication, but age would be one of them that young adults especially, because that's when they die, and of course other diseases, cancer and so forth. So the other one more, and that's our grandparents. A lot of times young adults will lose their grandparents, and that's a sad loss. It's also a loss that we tend to have more peace with,
because they've lived.
Right. The meaning we put on it is different.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Are there other types of losses besides losing like a person? I mean, I think about in my life, and one of the traumatic loss was actually a relationship that I was in.
Absolutely.
And I wasn't the one that instigated it, and all of a sudden now I have this vacancy, this emotional vacancy that I had to deal with, and I was thinking back. I was like, I kind of went through those steps.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In fact, with my classes, one of the things they have to do is to take a loss that they have, and they have to apply those tasks to it. Mm-hmm. And I get 2 responses to that. One of them is that they're surprised that they went through those 4 tasks and they didn't even know they were doing it. Mm-hmm. So that's one thing. And then the other is that they're surprised how much any loss fits those tasks.
Let me ask you this in a time. Thank you, Roberta. How would then a Christian support somebody in the middle of a grief or a loss?
Well, one of the things as Christians, we think we have to fix it. And one of the things we have to realize is this isn't about fixing it. Yeah. People are not, sick. They're grieving, And the biggest thing that we can do, we don't have to be an expert. We don't have to fix it.
And that's a relief.
We need to be there.
Just a ministry of presence, in other words.
Absolutely. A healing presence by being present to that person. That is the most thing we can do. In fact, you hear people talk about what meant the most is somebody that just came and sat and held their hand.
Wow. And I think, and there's other resources on our website on hopeonfire.org for those who want to know much more about grief. But this has been a really informative time. And I appreciate so much you being here, Roberta.
Thank you for having me.
And Rick as well, too. It's always a joy to co-host with you. Thanks. And thank you so much for watching. Living through a loss is really messy and it's hard, but obviously it's possible to find joy through brokenness. So no person understands like you do what you're going through, but our hope is that you can experience your journey with a God who is walking beside you. Thank you for joining us.
Hope on Fire is produced by Livestreams Media, a listener-supported ministry. To download a free copy of today's program or be a part of our social network, please visit our website at hopeonfire.org. You may also contact us by writing to Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860. Once again, that's Livestreams Media, P.O. Box 608513, Orlando, Florida 32860. Or online at hopeonfire.org. Thank you so much for your letters and continued support. Until next time, may God set your hope on fire.